The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's tavern like an impatient philosopher demanding answers. Inside, the warm amber light cast long shadows across worn wooden tables, creating an atmosphere thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Tonight, this ordinary Dublin pub would become the unlikely stage for an extraordinary encounter between two minds separated by 15 centuries, yet united by humanity's most enduring question. Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius sat alone in the corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Even in this modern setting, he carried himself with the dignity of Roman nobility, though his eyes held the depth of a man who had stared into the abyss of injustice and emerged with something resembling peace. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, caught the tavern's light as he gazed thoughtfully at the storm outside. The heavy oak door swung open with a creak that seemed to announce something significant. Michel Foucault stepped inside, shaking droplets from his leather jacket with the fluid motion of someone perpetually in motion. His bald head gleamed under the tavern lights, and behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes surveyed the room with the calculating intensity of a surgeon examining a patient. Where Boethius emanated stillness, Foucault radiated restless energy. Their eyes met across the crowded tavern, and something electric passed between them. Neither man fully understood how they had come to be here, in this moment, but both recognized the profound opportunity before them. Foucault approached the booth with purposeful strides, his boots clicking against the wooden floor like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. "Mind if I join you?" Foucault asked, though he was already sliding into the booth opposite Boethius. His voice carried the slight accent of his French origins, tinged with intellectual curiosity and barely contained impatience. Boethius gestured to the empty seat with a gentle smile. "Please, though I suspect our conversation tonight will be anything but peaceful." The bartender, sensing the weight of the moment, brought Foucault a glass of red wine without being asked. The French philosopher took a sip, studying his companion over the rim of his glass. "You know who I am, Michel Foucault. Your reputation precedes you by several centuries." Boethius's voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to weighing words carefully. "A man who spent his life examining the chains that bind us, questioning every structure, every assumption. And you," Foucault leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest, "are Boethius, the last of the Romans, they called you. A man who found consolation in philosophy while waiting for death in a prison cell." The thunder outside seemed to punctuate their introduction, as if the storm itself recognized the significance of this meeting. Around them, the tavern's other patrons continued their conversations, oblivious to the philosophical titans, now facing each other across a simple wooden table. "I find it fascinating," Foucault continued, swirling his wine, "that we should meet here tonight. Two men who lived through the collapse of their worlds, yet reached such different conclusions about how to respond." Boethius nodded slowly. "Indeed. You saw systems of power and dedicated your life to exposing their mechanisms, to encouraging resistance. I experienced the ultimate abuse of power and found my answer in acceptance, in understanding the greater order that governs all things." "Acceptance," Foucault repeated the word, as if tasting something bitter. "You speak of acceptance as if it were a virtue. But isn't acceptance simply another word for submission? For allowing injustice to continue unchallenged?" The older man's eyes flashed with something that might have been amusement. "And you speak of resistance as if struggle were inherently noble. But isn't rebellion sometimes just another form of blindness? A refusal to see the deeper patterns that govern existence?" The tension in their conversation was palpable now, drawing curious glances from nearby tables. Two intellectuals, separated by an impossible gulf of time, were about to engage in a battle of ideas that had raged in human hearts for millennia. "Tell me, Boethius," Foucault said, leaning back in his seat, "when you sat in that prison cell, waiting for execution, surrounded by the corruption and cruelty of King Theodoric's court, did you truly find peace in acceptance? Or did you simply tell yourself a beautiful lie to make the unbearable bearable?" Boethius was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of lived experience. "And tell me, Michel, when you spent decades analyzing the machinery of oppression, documenting every subtle way power shapes and controls human lives, did your resistance ever truly free anyone? Or did you simply create more sophisticated ways of seeing our chains?" The storm outside intensified, as if nature itself were responding to the philosophical earthquake beginning to unfold in this small corner of Dublin. These two brilliant minds, each shaped by their own era's particular forms of suffering and insight, were about to explore one of humanity's most fundamental questions. When faced with a world that seems broken, do we fight or do we find peace in understanding? Their debate would challenge everything both men believed about fate, freedom, power, and the human condition itself. Boethius took a deliberate sip of his tea, allowing the silence to settle between them like dust after a landslide. The ambient chatter of the tavern seemed to fade as he prepared to defend a philosophy forged in the crucible of personal catastrophe. "You ask me about acceptance as if it were weakness," he began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had faced death and emerged with clarity. "But let me tell you what I learned in that cell, Michel. True acceptance isn't surrender. It's the most profound form of understanding." Foucault leaned forward, his skepticism evident. "Understanding? You were imprisoned by a tyrant, stripped of your wealth, separated from your family, and sentenced to death for crimes you didn't commit. What exactly did you understand that made that acceptable?" "I understood that my suffering, terrible as it was, existed within a larger tapestry of meaning." Boethius's eyes grew distant, as if seeing something beyond the tavern walls. "Lady Philosophy came to me in that cell, not as some mystical vision, but as the accumulated wisdom of generations. She showed me that fortune, good or bad, is temporary. What matters is how we respond to it." "Lady Philosophy," Foucault repeated, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "A convenient personification of your own need to make sense of senseless cruelty. But tell me, did this philosophical comfort extend to the other prisoners, to the countless victims of Theodoric's regime, who never had the luxury of education or the time to contemplate higher meanings?" The question hit its mark. Boethius paused, acknowledging the challenge. "You raise the eternal criticism of philosophy, that it serves only the privileged few. But consider this. If even one person can find peace amid chaos, doesn't that prove something about the human capacity to transcend circumstances?" "Orishi," Foucault countered. "It proves the extraordinary capacity of the human mind to rationalize its own powerlessness." He took another sip of wine, his gaze never leaving Boethius's face. "Your divine providence sounds remarkably similar to what I would call an internalized acceptance of oppressive power structures." Boethius straightened, and for a moment, the ghost of his aristocratic heritage flickered across his features. "You misunderstand both divine providence and my experience of it. I'm not speaking of passive submission to human authority. King Theodoric was a man, flawed and ultimately accountable to the same cosmic order that governs us all. My acceptance wasn't of his power, but of the truth that his power was temporary and ultimately meaningless." "Meaningless?" Foucault's eyebrows rose. "Tell that to his victims. Tell that to their families. Your philosophical transcendence is a luxury built on the privilege of education and social position. What about those who lack the tools to construct such elaborate justifications for their suffering?" The accusation stung, because it contained a grain of truth that Boethius had wrestled with for centuries. "You think my peace came from privilege? I lost everything, Michel. Family, friends, fortune, freedom. Everything I had believed defined me was stripped away. In that nakedness, I discovered something that no earthly power could touch. And what was that?" Foucault's voice softened slightly, sensing the genuine pain beneath his opponent's philosophical armor. "The recognition that true happiness, true freedom, comes from aligning ourselves with the natural order of things. When we understand our place in the cosmic structure, when we see that even suffering serves a purpose we might not immediately comprehend, we find a peace that no tyrant can destroy." Foucault set down his wineglass with deliberate precision. "And there it is, the heart of our disagreement. You speak of a natural order, as if inequality and oppression were somehow ordained by the universe itself. But what you call cosmic order, I call the naturalization of power relations. Your philosophy doesn't transcend politics. It reinforces them by making them seem inevitable." "You're wrong," Boethius replied, his voice gaining strength. "The cosmic order I speak of isn't about human hierarchies or political structures. It's about something far more fundamental, the recognition that existence itself follows patterns and purposes that exceed our immediate understanding. When I accepted my fate, I wasn't endorsing Theodoric's justice. I was acknowledging that even injustice serves a function in the larger scheme of things." "But who determines this larger scheme?" Foucault pressed. "Who decides what purposes suffering serves, And why should we assume that acceptance of this supposed order is preferable to active resistance against demonstrable injustice? The fire crackled in the tavern's hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls as if the very flames were taking sides in their debate. Other patrons glanced their way, drawn by the intensity of the conversation, despite not understanding its full depth. "Consider this," Boethius said, leaning forward with renewed energy. "Your entire life's work was built on the premise that power structures can be analyzed, understood, and presumably changed. But what if some patterns of existence are so fundamental that resistance is not only futile, but actually harmful to our own flourishing?" Foucault's laugh was sharp, but not unkind. "Now you sound like every authoritarian who ever lived. Accept your lot because it's natural, inevitable, or divinely ordained. I've heard variations of that argument used to justify every form of oppression imaginable. And you sound like every revolutionary who ever believed that the perfect society was just one more uprising away." Boethius shot back. "How many revolutions have simply replaced one form of tyranny with another? How many resistors have become the very oppressors they once fought against?" The tension between them crackled like electricity, yet both men recognized they were engaged in something profound, a clash between two fundamentally different ways of understanding human existence and our relationship to forces beyond our control. Foucault's fingers drummed against the wooden table, a rhythmic counterpoint to the rain still battering the windows. His eyes held the gleam of someone preparing to dissect a particularly interesting specimen, and Boethius was about to become the subject of his analytical blade. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at your cosmic order, my friend," Foucault began, his voice carrying the precision of a surgeon making the first incision. "I see the most sophisticated form of social control ever devised, one so elegant that its victims thank their oppressors for the privilege of suffering." Boethius opened his mouth to respond, but Foucault raised a hand, his momentum building like a wave gathering force. "You speak of Lady Philosophy as if she were some neutral force of wisdom, but let's examine her more closely. She appears to you a Roman aristocrat, a man of letters, someone already embedded in the power structures of his time. She doesn't visit the slaves in the mines or the peasants in their hovels. She comes to someone who already has the cultural capital to understand her sophisticated arguments." The French philosopher leaned back, but his intensity never wavered. "This isn't coincidence, Boethius. It's the way power perpetuates itself, by convincing those who might otherwise resist that their suffering is meaningful, even necessary. You reduce everything to power relations," Boethius replied, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Can't you conceive of truth that exists beyond human politics?" "Truth?" Foucault's laugh held no warmth. "Truth is what those in power say it is, and the most insidious truth of all is the one that convinces people to police themselves, to accept their circumstances, not because they're forced to, but because they believe it's the right thing to do." He took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving Boethius's face. "I spent my career studying institutions, prisons, hospitals, schools, asylums. What I discovered was that modern power doesn't need chains and guards. It operates through knowledge, through the creation of categories and norms that shape how people understand themselves and their possibilities." "And what does this have to do with divine providence?" Boethius asked, though he sensed where this was leading. "Everything," Foucault said, his voice gaining intensity. "Your divine providence is the ultimate disciplinary mechanism. It doesn't need external enforcement because it operates from within. It creates subjects who monitor their own thoughts, who find meaning in their own subjugation, who transform resistance into acceptance through elaborate philosophical gymnastics." The tavern seemed to grow quieter around them, as if other conversations were being drawn into the gravitational pull of their debate. A couple at a nearby table had stopped talking entirely, their attention captured by the intellectual duel unfolding before them. "You want to know what I learned from studying power?" Foucault continued, his passion building. "I learned that it's not something that people possess. It's something that flows through relationships, through discourse, through the very categories we use to understand ourselves. And the most effective power is the kind that makes people complicit in their own control." Boethius felt the ground shifting beneath his philosophical feet. "So you're saying that my experience of consolation, my sense of peace in the face of injustice, that was all just an elaborate form of self-deception?" "I'm saying it was a product of your social position and cultural conditioning," Foucault replied. "You found comfort in philosophy because you had been trained from birth to see philosophical contemplation as valuable, as a mark of civilization, and superiority. Your transcendence reinforced the very hierarchies that made your suffering seem tragic, while the suffering of others remained invisible. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Boethius stared into his tea, seeing his reflection waver in the dark liquid. "You may be right about the privilege that shaped my response," he said slowly. "But does that negate the peace I found? Does the fact that my consolation was available only to someone of my background make it less real?" "It makes it complicit," Foucault said, but his voice softened slightly. "Your individual peace came at the cost of legitimizing the very system that created suffering for countless others. Every time someone points to your example as proof that adversity can be transcended through proper thinking, they're implicitly arguing that those who don't achieve such transcendence must be lacking in wisdom or virtue." Boethius looked up, his eyes reflecting a new kind of pain. "So you would have had me rage against my captors, die bitter and defeated. I would have had you recognize that your captivity was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a system designed to produce exactly the kind of subjects who find virtue in submission." Foucault's voice carried the weight of decades spent studying human subjugation. "Your response wasn't wrong because it failed to bring you peace. It was wrong because it failed to challenge the conditions that made such responses necessary." "And yet," Boethius said, a note of his former strength returning, "what has your lifetime of analysis accomplished? You've mapped the mechanisms of power with extraordinary precision, but have you freed anyone? Have you created any lasting change? Or have you simply given people more sophisticated ways to understand their helplessness?" The question struck Foucault like a blow to the solar plexus. For a moment, his analytical composure cracked, revealing something raw underneath. "At least I've tried to show people that what seems natural and inevitable is actually constructed, and therefore changeable. At least I've refused to sanctify suffering or dress oppression in the robes of cosmic purpose." "But what do you offer in place of the order you tear down?" Boethius pressed, sensing he had found a weakness in his opponent's armor. "What hope do you give to someone facing injustice, if not the possibility of transcendence?" Foucault was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still drumming against the table. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him before Boethius's eyes. "I offer the possibility of resistance, the chance to say no even when that refusal seems futile, the dignity of struggle, even when the outcome is uncertain." "And is that enough?" Boethius asked gently. "Is the mere act of resistance sufficient to justify a life spent in perpetual opposition to forces that may indeed be larger than ourselves?" The storm outside seemed to pause, as if waiting for Foucault's answer. The silence between them stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken tensions. Around the tavern, the evening crowd had thinned, leaving behind only the most dedicated drinkers and the two philosophers locked in their timeless struggle. The barkeeper polished glasses with mechanical precision, stealing glances at the intense conversation unfolding in the corner booth. Foucault finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a new quality, something raw and personal that hadn't been there before. "You ask if resistance is enough to justify a life. Let me tell you about a night in 1968, during the student uprising in Paris." He stared into his wine as if the dark liquid held memories worth drowning in. "I was 38 years old, watching young people build barricades in the streets, believing they could remake the world through sheer force of will, and I found myself caught between admiration and despair. Admiration for their courage, despair at my own knowledge of how power really works." Boethius leaned forward, sensing something crucial in his opponent's shift toward the personal. "What did you see that night?" "I saw the police charging with clubs and tear gas. I saw students beaten bloody for daring to imagine that education could be something other than a factory for producing compliant citizens, and I realized that my years of studying power had taught me how to analyze oppression but not how to effectively resist it." Foucault's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his glass. "That night, watching those young idealists face the full force of state violence, I understood something profound about the gap between knowledge and action, between understanding systems and changing them." "And what was that understanding?" Boethius asked, his voice gentle now, recognizing the pain in his companion's words. "That resistance might be necessary even when it's futile, that the act of saying no has value even when it doesn't produce the outcomes we desire." Foucault met Boethius's eyes directly. "Those students didn't overthrow capitalism or eliminate educational hierarchies. Most of them were absorbed back into the very system they had opposed. But for a brief moment, they had demonstrated that things could be different." Boethius nodded slowly. I begin to see the core of our disagreement more clearly now. You value the struggle itself, regardless of its ultimate success or failure. You find meaning in the refusal to accept, even when acceptance might bring peace. And you, Foucault replied, value the peace that comes from understanding, even when that understanding requires accepting things that might be changeable. We're both responding to the same fundamental human condition, the experience of finding ourselves in circumstances we didn't choose, subject to forces we can't fully control. The observation hung between them like a bridge neither man was quite ready to cross. Boethius turned his mug slowly in his hands, watching the steam rise and dissipate in the tavern's warm air. "Tell me about your prison cell," Foucault said suddenly. "Not the philosophical insights you derived from it, but the experience itself, the daily reality of waiting for death." Boethius was quiet for so long that Foucault began to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries-old pain. "The nights were the worst, not because of fear. I had made my peace with dying, but because of the silence. In that silence, I could hear the echoes of every choice I had made, every compromise I had accepted in the name of serving the greater good." He looked up at Foucault with eyes that held depths of regret. "You know what the cruelest irony was? I had spent my life serving a system I believed was just, trying to bridge the gap between Roman tradition and Gothic rule. I thought I was serving order, serving justice, and in the end that very system destroyed me. So why didn't that experience lead you to rebellion rather than acceptance?" Foucault asked, leaning forward with renewed intensity. "Because," Boethius said, his voice growing stronger, "I realized that the system that destroyed me was not the cosmic order I had glimpsed in my studies of philosophy and mathematics. It was a human corruption of that order, a distortion created by men drunk on power and blind to justice." Foucault shook his head. "But don't you see, that distinction between cosmic order and human corruption is precisely what allows oppressive systems to perpetuate themselves. They claim to represent higher truths while serving very earthly interests. And don't you see," Boethius countered, "that your rejection of any transcendent order traps people in a world where power relations are the only reality, where there's no appeal beyond human authority, no ground for hope beyond the possibility of successful resistance? The tension between them ratcheted up another notch. Other patrons glanced their way, sensing the electricity in the air without understanding its source. The barkeeper had stopped even pretending to work, frankly staring at the two men whose conversation seemed to contain the entire history of human thought about freedom and fate. "You're right about one thing," Foucault admitted. "My approach does tend toward a certain bleakness. If power relations are fundamental, if knowledge and truth are always compromised by the interests they serve, then hope becomes a more fragile thing. And yet you've never stopped writing, never stopped analyzing, never stopped trying to illuminate the mechanisms of control. Why continue if the situation is so bleak?" Foucault smiled for the first time that evening, an expression both bitter and beautiful. "Because the alternative is to let power operate in darkness, unchallenged and unexamined. Because even if we can't escape the systems that shape us, we can at least understand them. An understanding, even partial understanding, creates possibilities for resistance that wouldn't otherwise exist." "So in the end," Boethius said, "you do believe in something transcendent, the value of truth itself, the worth of human dignity, the possibility that consciousness can achieve something beyond mere self-interest." Foucault paused, caught off guard by the observation. "Perhaps. But if I do believe in such things, I locate them in human struggle rather than cosmic design. I find the sacred in resistance rather than acceptance." The storm outside was beginning to subside, but the tempest between them was just reaching its peak. The tavern had grown noticeably quieter as the night deepened, with only a handful of patrons remaining to witness this extraordinary collision of minds. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance in rhythm with the philosophical battle unfolding in the corner booth. Boethius studied Foucault's face in the dim light, seeing something he hadn't noticed before, a profound weariness that went deeper than intellectual fatigue. "Michel, may I ask you something personal?" Foucault tensed slightly, his analytical armor reasserting itself. "Everything we've discussed tonight has been personal, whether we've acknowledged it or not." "True enough," Boethius smiled sadly. "But I'm curious about something. You've spent your life studying the ways power shapes and controls human beings, documenting every subtle mechanism of social discipline and normalization. What has that knowledge cost you personally?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of discomfort across Foucault's features. He took a long sip of wine before answering, his voice carefully controlled. Knowledge always has a price. Once you've seen how thoroughly our supposedly free choices are shaped by invisible forces, it becomes difficult to act with the naive confidence that drives most human behavior. You mean it becomes difficult to hope, Boethius said gently. I mean it becomes difficult to deceive yourself about the nature of freedom. Foucault's voice carried an edge of defensiveness. Most people go through life believing they're autonomous agents, making independent choices. I've seen the machinery behind the curtain. I know how thoroughly our desires, our values, even our sense of self, are products of specific historical and social configurations. Boethius leaned back, his expression thoughtful. And yet you've continued to write, to teach, to engage with the world as if your choices matter. Isn't that a kind of faith in something beyond the power relations you've described? It's a commitment to the process of analysis itself, Foucault replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Even if our freedom is more constrained than we like to imagine, the act of understanding those constraints has value. Value according to whom? Determined by what standard? Boethius pressed gently. If all values are socially constructed, if all knowledge serves power, then what makes your particular perspective more valuable than the delusions you're trying to dispel? Foucault fell silent, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. When he looked up, his eyes held a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. You're forcing me to confront something I've spent decades avoiding. If I'm honest, my commitment to analysis and resistance is itself a kind of faith. Faith in the possibility that understanding can be its own form of freedom, even when it doesn't lead to practical change. And that faith, Boethius said softly, doesn't that point towards something that transcends the historical contingencies you've described? Some ground for human dignity and value that can't be reduced to power relations. The question hung in the air between them, like a challenge that neither man could ignore. Foucault stared into his wine, seeing his reflection fractured by the dark liquid surface. Perhaps, he admitted finally, but if such a ground exists, I locate it in the human capacity for resistance itself, not in acceptance of some predetermined order. The dignity I've glimpsed has always been in the moment when someone says no to power, when they refuse to be what the system wants them to be, and I, Boethius replied, have found that same dignity in the moment when someone says yes to existence itself, when they embrace their circumstances, not because those circumstances are just, but because the capacity to find meaning even in suffering reveals something indestructible about the human spirit. They sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, each man wrestling with the implications of their exchange. The barkeeper approached cautiously, offering refills that both men accepted with distracted nods. There's something else I need to tell you, Foucault said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. Something about my own experience of imprisonment. Boethius raised an eyebrow. You were imprisoned. Not in the way you were, but imprisoned nonetheless. Foucault's hands shook slightly as he lifted his glass. I spent years of my life confined by expectations, social, professional, personal. The expectations of what a respectable academic should be, how a man should love, what constituted normal versus deviant behavior. He met Boethius's eyes directly. I lived in the closet, as we call it now. I hid fundamental aspects of myself because the society I lived in had constructed elaborate systems for punishing sexual and social deviance. My resistance to power was born from intimate knowledge of how it operates on the most personal levels. Boethius nodded, understanding flooding his features. So when you speak of resistance, you're not just talking about abstract political theory. You're talking about the daily struggle to remain human in a world that wants to force you into predetermined categories. Exactly. Foucault's voice grew stronger. Every day I had to choose between authentic existence and social acceptance. Every relationship I formed had to be calculated against the risk of exposure and punishment. That's what shaped my understanding of how power works, not through dramatic moments of oppression, but through the constant, subtle pressure to conform to normalized expectations. And yet, Boethius observed, you found ways to resist, to create space for authentic existence even within those constraints. Isn't that its own form of transcendence? Its own proof that something in the human spirit can't be completely controlled? Foucault considered this, his analytical mind working through the implications, perhaps. But what I discovered is that resistance itself can become a form of identity, a way of defining oneself against rather than towards something. After decades of opposition, I sometimes wondered if I knew how to exist without something to fight against. The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, connecting two men whose experiences of confinement had led them to radically different conclusions about the meaning of freedom. The tavern had grown so quiet that the ticking of an old clock on the wall seemed to mark not just the passage of time, but the weight of centuries pressing down on their conversation. Only 3 patrons remained besides themselves: an elderly man nursing a pint of stout, a young couple sharing whispered conversations, and the barkeeper who had long since abandoned any pretense of not listening to every word. Boethius reached across the table, not quite touching Foucault's hand, but coming close enough that the gesture carried unmistakable warmth. "Michel, I think we've both been circling around something tonight without quite naming it." Foucault looked up from his wine, his defenses lowered by the intimacy of his recent admission. "What's that?" "The recognition that our positions aren't as opposed as we initially thought. You resist because you believe in something worth preserving: human dignity, the possibility of authentic existence, the value of truth. I accept because I believe in something larger than immediate circumstances: cosmic order, divine purpose, the meaningfulness of existence itself." Foucault frowned, his analytical mind immediately searching for the flaw in this apparent reconciliation. "But our methods and conclusions remain fundamentally different. You counsel acceptance of circumstances that might be changeable. I advocate resistance to conditions that might be necessary." "True," Boethius acknowledged, "but consider this. What if our apparent disagreement reflects not a fundamental philosophical divide, but different responses to the same underlying reality? What if the cosmic order I speak of includes, even requires, the resistance you champion?" The suggestion struck Foucault like a physical blow. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes wide with something approaching shock. "You're suggesting that resistance itself might be part of your divine plan, that rebellion serves some cosmic purpose? Why not?" Boethius's voice carried a new energy, as if he were discovering this possibility even as he spoke it. "Consider the patterns of history. Periods of oppression give rise to movements of liberation. Injustice creates the conditions for its own correction. What appears to be chaos and conflict from our limited perspective might be part of a larger rhythm, a cosmic dialectic that requires both establishment and rebellion, order and resistance." Foucault stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing through the implications. "But that would make my resistance merely another form of acceptance, wouldn't it? If rebellion serves cosmic order, then the rebel becomes an unwitting agent of the very transcendent authority he seeks to oppose. Or, Boethius suggested, it would make acceptance a more complex phenomenon than simple submission. If I accept not just current circumstances, but the legitimacy of resistance to those circumstances, then my acceptance includes the possibility of change, the value of struggle, the dignity of refusal." The barkeeper approached their table, clearly torn between professional discretion and philosophical fascination. "Forgive the interruption, gentlemen, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you saying that accepting injustice and fighting against it are somehow the same thing?" Both philosophers looked up, startled by the intervention, but not unwelcoming of it. Foucault gestured to an empty chair. "Please join us. Sometimes an outside perspective can illuminate what we're too close to see." The barkeeper, a man in his 50s with calloused hands and intelligent eyes, sat down hesitantly. "Patrick O'Brien," he said by way of introduction, "I've been listening to your conversation all evening, and it reminds me of something my grandmother used to say." "What was that?" Boethius asked, genuinely curious. "She used to say that the river accepts the stones in its path, but that doesn't stop it from wearing them down and finding its way to the sea." Patrick smiled apologetically. "Maybe that's too simple for your philosophical discussion, but it seems to me you're both talking about different ways of being like that river." Foucault and Boethius exchanged glances, both recognizing the profound simplicity of the metaphor. The river accepts its circumstances, but never stops moving, never stops exerting pressure against the obstacles it encounters. "That's remarkably apt," Foucault admitted. "The river doesn't rage against the stones or pretend they don't exist. It accommodates them while simultaneously working to transform the landscape they inhabit. And the stones," Boethius added, "play their own essential role. They shape the river's course, create eddies and currents, determine where the water pools and where it rushes. The relationship is truly dialectical. Neither element is passive." Patrick nodded, warming to the philosophical conversation. My grandmother lived through the Irish Civil War, the Troubles, decades of political upheaval. She said the mistake people make is thinking they have to choose between fighting and surrendering. Sometimes the wisest response is to flow around the obstacles while never stopping your movement toward where you need to go. The three men sat in contemplative silence, each processing the implications of this deceptively simple wisdom. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind a clarity that seemed to mirror their conversation's progression from conflict to complexity to something approaching synthesis. So where does this leave us? Foucault asked finally. If resistance and acceptance can both serve larger purposes, if rebellion and submission are both potential responses to the same fundamental human condition, how do we decide how to live? Boethius smiled, but it was a complex expression that contained both triumph and humility. Perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps instead of asking how we should live in general, we should ask how we can respond most authentically to our particular circumstances at our particular moment in history. You mean there's no universal answer? Foucault's voice carried both disappointment and relief. I mean the universal answer might be that authentic response requires both the capacity for acceptance and the capacity for resistance, both the wisdom to recognize what cannot be changed and the courage to challenge what should not be accepted. Patrick raised his glass, which had somehow acquired a drink during their conversation. To the river and the stones, then. To the tension that creates both movement and direction. Foucault and Boethius raised their own glasses, their eyes meeting across the table with something approaching understanding. Not agreement, their fundamental philosophical differences remained, but recognition of each other's wisdom, each other's necessity, in the larger conversation about what it means to be human in a world that often seems designed to diminish human dignity. To the unfinished symphony, Boethius said softly. To the recognition that our individual voices, whether they sing of acceptance or resistance, are part of a larger composition whose meaning emerges only in the interplay between them. As they drank, the clock on the wall chimed midnight, marking not an ending but a beginning, the start of a new day in which the eternal questions they had explored would continue to demand answers from every human heart. Their debate would live on, not because either man had won, but because both had illuminated essential truths about the human condition that future generations would need to rediscover for themselves. The tavern grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not the absence of conversation but the presence of understanding too deep for words.